Atlantis, myth or legend? For centuries, the legend of Atlantis has danced on the edge of myth and memory, dismissed by many but never forgotten. They once said the same of Troy, that Troy was a myth, that Homer's epics were poetic fiction. However, all this was revisited in the 19th century when an amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann unearthed ruins in the very lands of the ancient Greek world where Homer set his epic tales. Walls, weapons, layers of ash, it was all there, just as the poets had sung. So, if Troy could rise from myth into history, could Atlantis? Plato didn't claim to invent the story. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he traces the tale back to Solon, one of Athens' most revered lawmakers. Solon had travelled to Egypt, where priests at the Temple of Neith in Sais told him of a mighty island empire that existed beyond the Pillars of Heracles, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar. This civilization, Atlantis as he called it, once sought to conquer the known world, only to be defeated by ancient Athens and then swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. This wasn't just folklore. Plato placed the tale within Critias, a dialogue meant for philosophical seriousness. He used the Greek word mythos, a term not for fiction, but for meaningful narrative passed through generations. In ancient Greece, mythos often encoded cultural memory, sacred history, and veiled truths. In Critias, Plato writes, "Then listen, Socrates, to a tale which, though strange, is certainly true, having been attested by Solon, who was the wisest of the 7 sages. There were of old great and marvellous actions of the Athenian city, which have passed into oblivion through lapse of time and the destruction of mankind, and one in particular, greater than all the rest." Socrates replies, "Very good. And what is this ancient famous action of the Athenians, which Critias declared, on the authority of Solon, to be not a mere legend, but an actual fact?" Plato roots the Atlantis story in a chain of memory, from Egyptian priests to Solon to Critias to himself. This isn't fantasy, it's tradition, meticulously passed down. And remarkably, some of Plato's details, long dismissed as imaginary, like the hidden spring on the Athenian Acropolis, have later been validated by archaeology. If Plato was right about that, what else might he have remembered correctly? Stories of a lost land swallowed by catastrophe appear not just in Greek and Egyptian memory, but across the world. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec traditions speak of vanished homelands, Tolan, Aslan, and others, destroyed by floods or fire. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Maya, tells of repeated cycles of creation and destruction, worlds rising and falling, echoing the fate of Atlantis. One ancient document, the Troano manuscript of the Yucatan, describes the cataclysmic fall of a great land called Mua Posidonis, names eerily similar to Plato's Atlantis. It reads, "In the year 6 Khan, on the 11th Muluk in the month Zak, there occurred terrible earthquakes. The land of Mu was sacrificed. Being twice upheaved, it suddenly disappeared during the night, sinking with it 64 million inhabitants, 8,060 years before the writing of this book." If the dating is accurate, this disaster occurred roughly 9,000 years before Solon, matching Plato's timeline. Coincidence? Archetype, or the preserved memory of a global cataclysm? Skeptics call Atlantis an allegory, Plato's warning against imperial hubris, and perhaps it was. But myth and memory are not mutually exclusive. Troy was once a poem. The spring on the Acropolis was once a story. Atlantis may be a symbol, but symbols often have roots in real events. As the Egyptian priest said to Solon, quote, "O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are but children. You remember only one flood, but there have been many. In mind you are all young. There is no old tradition among you, no ancient signs preserved. You have to begin again like children after each destruction, forgetting what came before. What you call myth, we preserve as truth, written in our temples and handed down through generations. You speak of your ancestors and the oldest names you know, Pharonius, Niobe, Deucalion, but you know nothing of the true antiquity of your people. You forget that the noblest and most beautiful race of men once lived in your land, long before the great flood, and your city Athens was first in wisdom and war. That civilization, we know, flourished over 1,000 years before the founding of our own." End quote. He went on to explain that while the Greeks thought that their oldest history began with figures like Pharonius or Deucalion, these were but remnants of something far older, forgotten by their own people. The Egyptians claimed that Athens itself was once the most noble and powerful civilization on earth, thriving more than 1,000 years before the founding of Egypt, and that the Athenians of that age were descendant from a glorious race now lost to memory. This wasn't just a fable. Plato gives a very detailed description of Atlantis, with specific dimensions of its landscape and harbour. While some argue that the story serves Plato's philosophical purposes, does that mean it was entirely fabricated? But maybe the real question isn't, did Atlantis exist exactly as Plato described it, but rather, why do so many ancient civilizations, from Greece to Egypt to the Yucatan, remember a great land lost to the sea? And what truths might still lie beneath the waves and beneath our disbelief? If the Egyptian priests were right, and if Plato faithfully recorded what Solon was told, then Atlantis wasn't just a poetic metaphor. It was a memory, a story carried across millennia through oral tradition, sacred texts, and fading fragments of forgotten history. So when did this mighty civilization exist? And where was it? Plato gives us a precise answer. The priests of Sais told Solon that Atlantis had flourished 9,000 years before his time, placing it around 11,600 BCE at the end of the last ice age. That date is no accident. It coincides with the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden global climate disruption when sea levels rose, ice sheets melted, and the earth was wrecked by floods and earthquakes, conditions ripe for the destruction of coastal civilizations. As for its location, Plato is just as specific. Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. He describes it as a vast island, larger than Libya and Asia combined, ringed by concentric circles of land and sea, rich in natural resources, and ruled by a powerful seafaring empire. From there, the Atlanteans launched their conquest, enslaving all who lived within the pillars, from North Africa to Egypt and into Italy, all except one city, Athens. And here lies a question few ever ask. If Atlantis was so powerful, so advanced, so dominant, then what kind of civilization was prehistoric Athens that it alone could withstand them? Why have we spent millions searching for Atlantis, yet ignored the forgotten Athens Plato so vividly describes. If we accept the Atlantis narrative, we must accept all of it. We cannot cherry pick. Plato does not refer to the familiar Athens of Pericles and Socrates. He speaks of a much older city, a prehistoric Athens, one that excelled not only in warfare but in wisdom, virtue, and governance. In those distant times, the priest tells Solon, your city stood alone against the Atlanteans and triumphed, not merely surviving their attack, but defeating the greatest empire the world had ever seen. What kind of power did Athens possess? What legacy was buried when it too was lost to disaster? Fast forward to the 20th century. During World War II, Nazi forces swept through Greece, leaving devastation in their wake. But in the shadows of occupied villages, whispers circulated. Truckloads of German soldiers vanished into ancient caves under cover of night, only to emerge hours later bearing heavy crates, contents unknown. Night after night, the pattern repeated, yet the plundering of Greece didn't begin with the Nazis. Decades earlier, British and French archaeologists had already scoured the land, quietly extracting its treasures and secrets. Could part of this ancient knowledge already lie hidden in the vaults of foreign powers, with expeditions to find the missing pieces quietly continuing under the guise of archaeology? This raises a radical but compelling idea. What if two advanced civilizations once stood at opposite edges of the ancient world? Atlantis in the Atlantic, Athens in the Aegean. One vanished beneath the waves, the other faded into legend, and with them an entire epoch was erased, an age of giants, of forgotten cities, of memories hidden in myth. So perhaps the question isn't merely whether Atlantis existed, but rather, what else have we forgotten? And how close are we to remembering it?